In the glittering elegance of Hartley Hall, a priceless ruby ring vanishes during a lavish 1920s cocktail party, plunging the guests into a web of suspicion. Was it the glamorous hostess, Mrs. Hartley, staging a theft for insurance? The debt-ridden Mr. Blake, desperate for a windfall? The ambitious caterer, Mrs. Weston, eyeing a fortune to fund her dreams? Or the enigmatic jeweler, Mr. Duval, with his cunning expertise? As secrets unravel, only Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and village wisdom, can untangle the clues: jeweler's rouge, a ruby bead, a loose window latch, to reveal a calculated deception. In a world of greed and glamour, one truth shines: nothing is as it seems. Chapter 1. The Glittering Assembly. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the ancient elms that lined the drive to Hartley Hall. The manor, a Georgian gem with ivy-clad walls and tall sash windows, stood as the pride of the village, its elegance matched only by the reputation of its mistress, Mrs. Eleanor Hartley. Tonight, the hall was alive with the hum of a cocktail party, a rare event that had drawn the curious and the envious from every corner of the county. Mrs. Hartley, a widow whose charm had not dimmed with her years, had promised a spectacle: the unveiling of her newest treasure, a ruby ring said to rival the crown jewels in its fiery brilliance. Inside the drawing room, chandeliers sparkled, their light dancing on polished silver trays and the delicate stems of champagne flutes. The air was thick with the scent of tuberose and the murmur of polite conversation, punctuated by bursts of laughter. Guests in tailored suits and shimmering gowns drifted between clusters, their voices weaving a tapestry of gossip and admiration. At the heart of it all stood Mrs. Hartley, resplendent in a sapphire silk gown that clung to her slender frame. On her left hand, the ruby ring gleamed, a single, flawless stone, blood-red and luminous, set in an intricate gold band that whispered of a bygone era. She held court with practiced ease, her laughter bright as she displayed the ring to a circle of admirers, its facets catching the light with every graceful gesture. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the room's clamor, as her eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, missed nothing. She wore a simple black dress, her only adornment a cameo brooch, yet her presence carried a weight that belied her unassuming demeanor. To the uninitiated, she was merely a spinster with a fondness for wool and village life. To those who knew her, she was a mind as incisive as a scalpel, slicing through the veneer of human behavior to reveal the truths beneath. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Mrs. Hartley, noting the way her hostess's eyes flickered with pride each time a guest complimented the ring. There was something almost feverish in her delight, as if the jewel were not merely an ornament, but a talisman of her status. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the village whispers. Mrs. Hartley's fortune, though substantial, was not inexhaustible, and her love of grandeur occasionally outstripped her means. The ring, purchased at a London auction, had been the talk of St. Mary Mead for weeks, its cost a subject of fevered speculation. Among the guests, Miss Marple picked out 3 figures of particular interest. Mr. Lionel Blake, a robust man with a florid complexion and a booming laugh, stood near the grand piano, regaling a group with tales of his latest jaunt to Monte Carlo. His tailored jacket strained slightly at the seams, a testament to his fondness for good living. but Miss Marple noted a nervous twitch in his fingers as he adjusted his tie. She recalled the village rumor that Mr. Blake's gambling habit had left him in debt to less than savory creditors, a detail that made his presence near the priceless ring intriguing. Across the room, Mrs. Clara Weston, the caterer, moved with brisk efficiency, her dark eyes scanning the trays of canapés and petit fours with proprietary zeal. Her business had transformed village gatherings, her culinary artistry earning her a reputation that reached as far as London. Yet there was a tightness to her smile, a hint of strain as she directed her staff, as if her ambitions stretched beyond the confines of a provincial kitchen. Miss Marple wondered what price such ambition might demand, and whether a ruby ring might tempt a woman so determined to climb. Then there was Mr. Victor Duval, a jeweler from London, whose lean frame and impeccable suit marked him as an outsider among the village gentry. He stood alone by a window, his dark eyes fixed on Mrs. Hartley's hand, with an intensity that bordered on professional. When she passed near him, he offered a measured compliment on the ring's craftsmanship, his voice smooth as polished stone. Miss Marple caught the exchange, noting the way his fingers brushed his waistcoat pocket, where the faint outline of a small tool, perhaps a jeweler's loop, could be discerned. His expertise, she mused, gave him a unique perspective on the ring's value and perhaps its vulnerabilities. As the evening wore on, the room grew warmer, the guests' voices rising in a crescendo of merriment. Mrs. Hartley, flushed with champagne and attention, moved from group to group, the ruby ring a constant focal point. Miss Marple watched as she paused to adjust a glove, the ring catching the chandelier's light in a blaze of crimson. It was then that the hostess excused herself, murmuring about a quick visit to the powder room. The moment passed unnoticed by most, but Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind registering the brief absence. The clock on the mantel chimed 8:30, its delicate notes barely audible over the din. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, cataloging positions. Mr. Blake, now at the sideboard, pouring a generous measure of whiskey. Mrs. Weston, slipping toward the kitchen door, her apron crisp against her dark dress. Mr. Duval, still by the window, his gaze now on the crowd rather than the ring. The scene was orderly, yet Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent, a subtle shift in the air, like the moment before a storm. Then came the scream, sharp, piercing, cutting through the laughter like a shard of glass. The room froze, all eyes turning to Mrs. Hartley, who stood in the doorway, her face ashen, her left hand bare. "My ring!" she cried, her voice trembling with shock. "It's gone!" The ruby ring, the evening's crowning glory, had vanished, and with it, the glittering illusion of harmony at Hartley Hall. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The silence that followed Mrs. Eleanor Hartley's scream was as sharp as the chime of broken crystal. The drawing-room of Hartley Hall, moments ago a stage for laughter and clinking glasses, now held its breath, the guests frozen in a tableau of shock. Mrs. Hartley stood in the doorway, her sapphire gown slightly askew, her bare left hand extended as if to conjure the missing ruby ring from the air. Her face, usually composed in the serene mask of a seasoned hostess, was a study in dismay. Eyes wide, lips parted, a flush of distress creeping up her throat. The ring, that fiery emblem of her triumph, was gone, and with it, the evening's carefully curated elegance. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the fireplace, set her knitting aside with deliberate care, her fingers steady despite the sudden tension in the room. Her spectacles glinted as she surveyed the scene, her mind already sifting through the kaleidoscope of details. The guests' startled expressions, the faint clatter of a dropped spoon, the way the chandelier's light seemed to mock the absence of the ruby's glow. She noted Mrs. Hartley's trembling hand, the way it clutched the door frame for support, and the curious hush that had fallen over the crowd, as if each guest feared to be the first to speak. "Eleanor, my dear, what's happened?" ventured Mrs. Pumphrey, a plump widow whose penchant for gossip was matched only by her fondness for sherry. Her voice broke the spell, and a murmur rippled through the room, a mix of concern and barely concealed excitement. A theft at Hartley Hall was no small matter. It was the sort of scandal that would fuel village talk for months. "It's gone," Mrs. Hartley repeated, her voice cracking. "My ruby ring. It was on the vanity in the powder room, and now it's gone." She took a faltering step forward, and Mr. Lionel Blake, ever the gallant despite his earlier unease, rushed to her side, offering an arm. She leaned into him, her distress palpable, though Miss Marple's keen eyes detected a flicker of something else. Calculation, perhaps, in the way Mrs. Hartley's gaze swept the room, as if gauging her audience. Inspector Harold Crane, summoned from the nearby town of Much Benham, arrived with a promptness that suggested he had been waiting for just such a drama to enliven his evening. A tall man with a stern jaw and eyes that missed little, he strode into the drawing room, his overcoat still dusted with the evening's dew. His presence brought a semblance of order, the guests parting to allow him passage. He nodded curtly to Mrs. Hartley, who had now composed herself enough to sit on a velvet settee, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief. "Mrs. Hartley, if you please," Inspector Crane said, his voice clipped but not unkind. "Tell me exactly what occurred." He produced a notebook, his pencil poised, and the room leaned in, eager for details. Mrs. Hartley drew a shuddering breath, her eyes darting to the assembled guests before settling on the inspector. "It was just after 8:30, she began. "I felt a touch warm, you see, and my hands were sticky from the punch. I slipped into the powder room to freshen up. Oh, it was only for a moment. I took off the ring just to wash my hands and placed it on the marble vanity near the basin. I was careful, I swear. I dried my hands, and when I turned back, I realized I'd left the ring behind. I was only in the drawing room for a few minutes, chatting with Mrs. Pumphrey, when I noticed my hand felt bare. I rushed back and it was gone. The door was ajar, and the ring was nowhere to be seen." Inspector Crane scribbled rapidly, his brow furrowed. "The powder room, you say? Was anyone with you when you left the ring? Did you see anyone nearby?" Mrs. Hartley shook her head, her sapphire earrings catching the light. "No, no one. The hallway was empty when I went in, and I didn't notice anyone when I came out." "Oh, Inspector, it's worth a fortune. It's irreplaceable." Her voice rose, and Miss Marple noted a theatrical edge to it, as if Mrs. Hartley were playing to the gallery. The hostess was no stranger to drama, and Miss Marple wondered if her distress was entirely unfeigned. The inspector turned to the guests. "Did anyone see Mrs. Hartley leave for the powder room or return? Or perhaps someone near the hallway at that time?" His tone was neutral, but his eyes scanned the room with a predator's focus. A few guests murmured denials, their voices overlapping in a chorus of innocence. Mr. Lionel Blake, still hovering near Mrs. Hartley, cleared his throat. I was by the sideboard, Inspector, pouring a drink, didn't see a thing. His joviality was strained, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers fidgeted with his cufflinks, a nervous tic she had observed earlier. Mrs. Clara Weston, the caterer, stepped forward, her apron immaculate despite the evening's demands. "I was in the kitchen, overseeing the staff," she said, her voice crisp. "We were busy with the canapés, crab puffs and cucumber sandwiches, you know. I didn't leave the kitchen until after the—" Scream! Her dark eyes met the inspector's without flinching, but Miss Marple caught a slight tremor in her hands, quickly concealed as she smoothed her apron. Mr. Victor Duval, the London jeweler, remained by the window, his posture relaxed, but his expression guarded. "I was here, admiring the view," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the darkened gardens. "I didn't notice Mrs. Hartley leave or return." His voice was smooth, almost too polished, and Miss Marple's mind ticked over the way his eyes had lingered on the ruby ring earlier in the evening. Inspector Crane nodded, his pencil pausing. "Very well. I'll need to see the powder room. No one is to leave this house until I've conducted my inquiries." He signaled to a young constable who had arrived with him, instructing him to guard the front door. Then, with a brisk stride, he headed toward the hallway, Mrs. Hartley trailing behind, her handkerchief pressed to her lips. Miss Marple, unnoticed in the flurry, rose quietly and followed at a discreet distance. The powder room, tucked off a narrow corridor near the drawing room, was a small but elegant space, its walls papered in pale green silk, its marble vanity gleaming under a gilt-framed mirror. A single window, high and narrow, admitted a sliver of moonlight, its latch slightly askew. The inspector knelt to examine the floor, his fingers brushing the polished wood, while Mrs. Hartley hovered, pointing to the vanity where the ring had last been seen. "It was right there," she said, indicating a spot near the porcelain basin. "I placed it carefully, I swear. Oh, how could this happen?" Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. She stepped closer to the vanity, her eyes catching a faint smudge of reddish powder near the basin's edge. It was barely noticeable, a dusting that might have been overlooked by a less observant eye. Rouge, perhaps? Or something else. Jeweler's rouge, used for polishing gems. She filed the thought away, her gaze shifting to the window. The latch, she noted, was loose, its mechanism worn. A gentle push might open it, allowing access from the garden outside. Yet the flower bed beyond showed no signs of disturbance, no crushed petals, no footprints in the soft earth. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A window left ajar could be a clue, or a deliberate misdirection. She glanced at the door, its hinges silent, suggesting it could be opened and closed without a sound. The powder room's proximity to the bustling drawing room meant anyone could have slipped in unnoticed during the party's chaos. Inspector Crane, rising from his inspection, turned to Mrs. Hartley. "Was the window open when you left the ring?" Mrs. Hartley frowned, her brow creasing. I don't recall. It might have been. It was warm tonight, and I may have opened it earlier to let in some air." Her uncertainty was plausible, but Miss Marple noted the way. Her eyes avoided the inspector's, as if she were reluctant to commit to an answer. The inspector made a note, then addressed the constable. "Search the garden outside this window. Look for any signs of entry, footprints, broken branches, anything." The constable nodded and hurried out, while Crane turned back to the room. "I'll need statements from everyone present. Mrs. Hartley, you'll stay here. The rest of you return to the drawing room." As the guests filed out, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes sweeping the powder room one last time. The smudge of powder nagged at her, a detail that didn't quite fit. She thought of Mr. Duval's expertise, the way his fingers had brushed his pocket where a jeweler's tool might hide. She recalled Mrs. Weston's brisk efficiency, her brief absence from the kitchen, and Mr. Blake, his nervous fidgeting, his proximity to the hallway. Each had opportunity, but motive remained elusive. Back in the drawing room, the atmosphere had shifted from shock to unease. Guests whispered in small groups, their eyes darting toward the hallway. Mrs. Pumphrey, sipping her sherry, leaned toward Miss Marple. "A dreadful business, Jane. Do you think it was one of us? Or some outsider sneaking in through that window?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles resuming their rhythm. "People are rarely as careful as they think, Mrs. Pumphrey. A ring like that doesn't vanish by accident." Her words were gentle, but her mind was already turning over the possibilities. The powder room was a stage, and the theft a carefully scripted act. But whose hand had directed it? She thought of Mrs. Hartley's theatrical distress, the way her story had been delivered with just enough detail to convince, yet not enough to clarify. Was she truly a victim, or had she staged the theft for reasons yet unknown? Insurance, perhaps, or a bid for attention? Miss Marple's village wisdom told her that wealth often bred such schemes, and Mrs. Hartley's love of grandeur was no secret. Then there was Mr. Blake, whose gambling debts were the talk of St. Mary Mead's less charitable circles. A man in need of funds might see a ruby ring as salvation, but his alibi, though shaky, was supported by the crowd. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Pumphrey's earlier comment about seeing him near the hallway, a discrepancy he had brushed off with a laugh. His nervousness suggested guilt, but of what? Mrs. Weston, too, intrigued her. The caterer's ambition was palpable, her catering empire a testament to her drive. A stolen ring could fund her dreams of expansion, but her staff's loyalty seemed to place her in the kitchen at the critical moment. Yet that brief absence to check a delivery, could it have been a cover for a swift detour to the powder room? And Mr. Duval, the jeweler, remained the most enigmatic. His calm was a mask, Miss Marple suspected, hiding a mind accustomed to precision and deception. A man who could appraise a gem with a glance could also replicate one, given time and skill. The smudge of powder on the vanity, was it a trace of his trade, left in haste? His detachment suggested confidence, but Miss Marple knew that confidence could be a thief's greatest asset. As Inspector Crane began his interviews, calling guests one by one to a side parlor, Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her knitting a soothing rhythm. The ruby ring was more than a jewel. It was a mirror, reflecting the desires and secrets of those who coveted it. Someone in this room had seen their chance and taken it, but the how and why remained just out of reach. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and unyielding behind her spectacles, scanned the crowd, certain of one thing. The truth was here, hidden in plain sight, waiting for her to unravel it. Chapter 3. The Hostess's Tale. The drawing room of Hartley Hall, though still aglow with the soft radiance of chandeliers, had taken on a somber air, as if the very walls sensed the violation of the evening's harmony. The guests, now seated in uneasy clusters, whispered speculations, while Inspector Crane's measured voice echoed from the side parlor, where he conducted his interviews. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, the bereaved hostess, remained on the velvet settee, her sapphire gown a stark contrast to her pallor. Her handkerchief, now crumpled, was clutched in one hand, while the other, bare of its ruby ring, rested limply in her lap. To the casual observer, she was the picture of a woman wronged by fate, but Miss Jane Marple, seated once more with her knitting, saw more than most. Miss Marple's needles moved with their usual precision, a quiet counterpoint to the tension that hung like a fog. Her eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, studied Mrs. Hartley with the same care she might give a tangled skein of wool. There was something in the hostess's demeanor, a certain poise beneath the distress, a flicker of awareness in her glances that suggested more than simple shock. Miss Marple had known women like Mrs. Hartley in St. Mary Mead, those who thrived on attention, who could turn misfortune into a stage for their own performance. Was the missing ring truly a loss, or was it a prop in a drama of her own devising? Inspector Crane emerged from the parlor, his notebook tucked under his arm, and beckoned Mrs. Hartley with a courteous but firm gesture. "If you'll come with me, Mrs. Hartley, I'd like to go over your account again. Details matter in a case like this." His tone was professional, but Miss Marple caught the faintest edge of skepticism, as if he, too, sensed the theatricality in her distress. Mrs. Hartley rose, smoothing her gown with a practiced hand, and followed the inspector, her chin lifted in a show of resilience. Miss Marple, ever discreet, waited a moment before slipping into the parlor after them, her presence unnoticed amid the guests' murmurs. She took a seat near the door, her knitting bag at her side, and listened as the inspector began his questioning. "Now, Mrs. Hartley," Crane said, settling into a chair opposite her, "let's be precise. You left the ring on the vanity at 8:30, you say. How long were you away from the powder room?" Mrs. Hartley's eyes widened, her handkerchief pressed briefly to her lips. "Oh, Inspector, it was no more than 5 minutes, I'm sure. I washed my hands, adjusted my hair, and returned to the drawing room. I was speaking with Mrs. Pumphrey about her garden roses when I realized the ring was missing. I rushed back at once, and, oh, it was dreadful. The door was ajar, and the ring was gone." Crane's pencil scratched across his notebook. "And you're certain you left the ring on the vanity, not, say, in your pocket or elsewhere?" "Certain." Mrs. Hartley's voice rose, indignant. "I placed it right there, on the marble, next to the basin. I was so careful, knowing its value. It was a Burmese ruby, Inspector, set in gold filigree. Priceless, really. I couldn't bear to lose it." Her voice trembled, and a single tear traced a delicate path down her cheek, catching the light. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, noted the tear's perfect timing. She recalled Mrs. Hartley's earlier display in the drawing room, the way her scream had silenced the crowd, drawing every eye to her plight. It was a performance, perhaps, but a convincing one. Yet there was something else, a fleeting glance toward the parlor window, as if Mrs. Hartley expected someone to be watching. Miss Marple's mind turned over the possibility of a staged theft, perhaps for insurance or sympathy. Such things were not uncommon among those who lived for the spotlight. "Did anyone see you leave the powder room?" Crane pressed, his eyes narrowing. "Or perhaps someone was in the hallway when you returned." Mrs. Hartley shook her head, her earrings swaying. "No, the hallway was quiet. The party was so lively, you see. Everyone was in the drawing room, laughing and talking. I didn't notice anyone nearby." Her voice faltered, and she dabbed at her eyes. "Oh, Inspector, you must find it. It's not just the cost, it's the sentiment. It was a gift from my late husband, you know, before he passed." Miss Marple's needles paused. A gift from her late husband? The village gossip, which Miss Marple never dismissed, had placed the ring's purchase at a recent London auction, not as a sentimental heirloom. Mrs. Hartley's wealth, while substantial, was known to be carefully managed, and such an extravagant purchase had raised eyebrows. The discrepancy intrigued Miss Marple. Was the story of the ring's origin a fabrication to deepen her victimhood, or had she misspoken in her distress? Crane made a note, his expression unreadable. "And the window in the powder room. You mentioned it might have been open. Did you open it yourself?" Mrs. Hartley hesitated, her fingers twisting the handkerchief. I may have. It was warm, and I thought a bit of air would be refreshing, but I can't be sure. Everything happened so quickly." Her uncertainty was plausible, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to the side, avoiding the inspector's gaze. It was a small tell, but Miss Marple had seen such gestures in St. Mary Mead's less truthful residents. A vicar's wife, who claimed her roses were her own work, a shopkeeper who swore his scales were honest. The inspector leaned forward. "Mrs. Hartley, forgive me, but I must ask, the ring was insured, was it not?" Mrs. Hartley's cheeks flushed, and she drew herself up, her voice sharp. "Of course it was insured. A jewel like that. Do you think I'd be so foolish as to leave it unprotected? But that's hardly the point, Inspector. I want my ring back, not a check from some insurance company." Her indignation seemed genuine, but Miss Marple wondered if it was too vehement, as if designed to deflect suspicion. Crane nodded, jotting another note. "Very well. We'll need the details of the insurance policy, and I'll ask you to remain here while I speak to the others." He rose, signaling the end of the interview, and Mrs. Hartley stood, her composure regained, though her eyes lingered on the inspector with a hint of wariness. As she returned to the drawing-room, Miss Marple remained in the parlor, her knitting resumed, but her mind racing. Mrs. Hartley's story was consistent, yet it lacked the ring of unvarnished truth. The mention of her late husband, the hesitation about the window, the perfectly timed tear, all suggested a woman accustomed to shaping perceptions. Miss Marple thought of the powder room's smudge of reddish powder, the loose window latch. Could Mrs. Hartley have arranged the theft herself, perhaps to claim the insurance while keeping the ring hidden? Such schemes were not unknown, and her financial strain, whispered about in the village, made it plausible. Yet there were other possibilities. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the guests she had observed earlier. Mr. Lionel Blake, with his gambling debts and nervous demeanor, had been near the hallway. According to Mrs. Pumphrey's gossip, Mrs. Clara Weston, the ambitious caterer, had admitted to stepping away from the kitchen, her absence brief but telling. And Mr. Victor Duval, the jeweler, with his calm expertise and lingering glances at the ring, had the knowledge to orchestrate a theft and perhaps replace the gem with a fake. Each had opportunity, and each had a motive that flickered just beneath the surface. Miss Marple slipped out of the parlor, her steps light, and rejoined the guests in the drawing-room. The atmosphere was tense, the earlier gaiety replaced by suspicion. Mrs. Hartley had resumed her place on the settee, now surrounded by a small court of sympathizers, her distress a magnet for attention. Miss Marple took her seat, her needles clicking, and watched as Inspector Crane called Mr. Blake to the parlor. she thought of the village of St. Mary Mead's quiet rhythms, where secrets were rarely as well hidden as their keepers believed. People, she knew, were predictable in their flaws. Greed, pride, ambition. The ruby ring was a spark that had ignited those flaws, and Miss Marple was determined to trace the flame to its source. She glanced at Mrs. Hartley, whose eyes met hers for a fleeting moment before looking away. There was something there, Miss Marple thought, a secret, perhaps, or a fear. Whatever it was, she would find it, as surely as she unraveled the knots in her wool. Chapter 4. The Guest's Alibi. The drawing-room of Hartley Hall, though still grand in its chandelier-lit splendor, had taken on the air of a stage where the players awaited their cues with bated breath. The guests, their earlier conviviality replaced by a wary stillness, sat in scattered groups, their whispers barely audible over the occasional clink of a glass or the rustle of a gown. Inspector Crane's methodical interviews had cast a shadow over the evening, and the absence of Mrs. Hartley's ruby ring hung like a specter, turning friend into potential foe. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced once more in her corner with her knitting, observed the scene with her usual quiet intensity, her needles moving in a steady rhythm that belied the swift workings of her mind. Mr. Lionel Blake, the jovial landowner whose ruddy complexion and booming laugh had earlier filled the room, now stood as Inspector Crane summoned him to the side parlor. His broad shoulders, usually squared with confidence, seemed to sag slightly under the weight of scrutiny, and his fingers, perpetually fidgeting with his cufflinks, betrayed a nervousness that Miss Marple had noted from the evening's start. She watched as he followed the inspector, his gait less assured than usual, and her thoughts turned to the village whispers about his gambling debts, a topic that had surfaced more than once at the St. Mary Mead post office. Miss Marple's seat, strategically chosen near the parlor door, allowed her to overhear snatches of the conversation within, her presence as unremarkable as the wallpaper to the distracted guests. Inspector Crane's voice, steady and precise, carried just enough for her to piece together the exchange. "Mr. Blake," Crane began, his pencil poised over his notebook, "you stated you were by the sideboard, pouring a drink, when Mrs. Hartley discovered the ring was missing. Can you confirm your whereabouts between 8:30 and 9 o'clock? Mr. Blake's response came with a forced heartiness, as if he hoped to charm his way through suspicion. "Absolutely, Inspector. I was right there in the drawing room, regaling old Dr. Haydock with tales from Monte Carlo. Never left the room, not for a moment. Ask anyone, Mrs. Pumphrey, Mr. Cleary, they'll vouch for me." His voice carried a note of bravado, but Miss Marple detected a slight quaver, a crack in his usual bluster. Crane's tone remained even. "And you didn't approach the hallway leading to the powder room, not even to fetch something or speak to someone?" "Not a step," Mr. Blake declared, though his words came too quickly, as if rehearsed. "I was by the sideboard, as I said, pouring a whiskey. The party was in full swing, hardly the time to wander off, eh?" He chuckled, but the sound was hollow, and Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered his insistence. A man so adamant about his alibi often had reason to fear its scrutiny. Crane made a note, the scratch of his pencil audible in the quiet parlor. "Very well. Did you see Mrs. Hartley leave for the powder room or return, or anyone else near the hallway?" Mr. Blake hesitated, a pause so brief it might have gone unnoticed by a less attentive listener. Can't say I did, Inspector. I was deep in conversation, you see. Mrs. Hartley was flitting about, showing off that ring of hers, but I didn't notice her slip away. As for the hallway, well, it's a busy house. People come and go. His vagueness was telling, and Miss Marple's mind flickered to Mrs. Pumphrey's earlier remark, made in a conspiratorial whisper over her sherry. She had seen Mr. Blake near the hallway just before Mrs. Hartley's scream, adjusting his tie and looking rather flustered. As Crane continued his questions, Miss Marple rose quietly, her knitting tucked into her bag, and moved toward the drawing-room sideboard, where Mr. Blake claimed to have been stationed. The sideboard, a heavy mahogany piece laden with decanters and crystal glasses, stood near the entrance to the hallway, its position offering a clear view of the powder room's door, some 10 feet away. She ran a finger along the polished surface, noting a faint ring of condensation where a glass had rested, perhaps Mr. Blake's whiskey. But the proximity to the hallway intrigued her. A man pouring a drink could easily glance down the corridor, or even step into it, unnoticed in the party's bustle. She returned to her seat as Mr. Blake emerged from the parlor, his face flushed and his smile strained. He rejoined the guests, accepting a glass of brandy from a sympathetic Mrs. Pumphrey, who clucked over him like a mother hen. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the way. His eyes darted toward the hallway, as if expecting something or someone to appear. His alibi, supported by several guests, held for now, but Mrs. Pumphrey's observation gnawed at her. She resolved to speak with the widow later, for Mrs. Pumphrey's gossip, though often embellished, had a kernel of truth that could prove invaluable. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Mr. Blake's circumstances. The village had long buzzed with tales of his extravagance, lavish trips to Monte Carlo, a new motor car, a penchant for high-stakes card games. Such a lifestyle required funds, and the whispers of debts to unsavory creditors had grown louder in recent months. A ruby ring, worth a small fortune, would be a tempting prize for a man in financial straits. Yet his presence in the drawing room, corroborated by others, suggested he had little opportunity to slip into the powder room unnoticed. Or had he? The party's chaos, with guests milling about and servants weaving through with trays, provided cover for a quick movement. Miss Marple considered the timing. Mrs. Hartley had left the ring at 8:30, and the scream came at 9. 30 minutes was ample time for a determined man to act, especially one familiar with Hartley Hall's layout. She recalled the smudge of reddish powder on the powder room's vanity, a detail that lingered in her mind like an unresolved chord. Mr. Blake, with his florid complexion and penchant for theatrics, seemed an unlikely candidate for such a precise clue, but Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss him. People, she had learned, could surprise even the most astute observer, and Mr. Blake's nervousness suggested a secret he was keen to keep. As Inspector Crane called the next guest, Mrs. Clara Weston, the caterer, Miss Marple's attention shifted briefly to the kitchen door, where a young server emerged with a tray of canapes. The server's uniform, a crisp black affair with red piping, caught her eye, reminding her of the ruby-colored bead she had found in the kitchen during her earlier inspection. The bead, tucked safely in her pocket, was a small but nagging clue, pointing to someone in a similar uniform, perhaps Mrs. Weston or one of her staff. But Mr. Blake's proximity to the hallway kept him in her thoughts, a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. She approached Mrs. Pumphrey, who was now deep in conversation with a local magistrate and waited for a lull before speaking. "Mrs. Pomfrey," she said, her voice soft but deliberate, "you mentioned seeing Mr. Blake near the hallway earlier. Could you tell me more? It's such a dreadful business, and every detail helps." Mrs. Pomfrey's eyes lit up, delighted to be of use. "Oh, Jane, it was just before poor Eleanor's scream. I was by the piano, chatting with Dr. Haydock, when I saw Mr. Blake step toward the hallway. He was fussing with his tie, looking ever so agitated. I thought he might be feeling ill, but then he came back to the sideboard, quick as you please, and poured that whiskey he's so fond of." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Mind you, he didn't look himself. Quite jumpy, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, though her mind was racing. "And did you see anyone else near the hallway? It's such a busy evening. It's hard to keep track." Mrs. Pomfrey frowned, her brow creasing. "Well, there was that caterer, Mrs. Weston, popping in and out of the kitchen. And that jeweler fellow, Mr. Duval, was by the window, but I don't think he moved. Everyone else was in the thick of things, laughing and carrying on." She sighed, sipping her sherry. "Who'd have thought such a thing could happen here?" Miss Marple thanked her, returning to her chair as Inspector Crane emerged to summon Mrs. Weston. The discrepancy in Mr. Blake's story, his claim of never leaving the sideboard, contradicted by Mrs. Pomfrey's sighting, suggested he was not as anchored as he claimed. Yet his alibi, backed by multiple guests, made a theft seem improbable, unless he had acted with remarkable speed. Miss Marple thought of the powder room's loose window latch, the absence of footprints outside. An inside job seemed more likely, and Mr. Blake's nervous demeanor kept him firmly in her sights. As she resumed her knitting, Miss Marple's mind sifted through the evening's details: the smudge of powder, the bead, the timing of Mrs. Hartley's absence. Mr. Blake's debts gave him motive, and his proximity to the hallway gave him opportunity. But the precision of the theft suggested a mind more calculating than his bluff exterior implied. She glanced at him across the room, where he now laughed too loudly at a remark, his hand gripping his brandy glass. The ruby ring, she knew, was more than a jewel. It was a key to unlocking the secrets of those who coveted it, and Mr. Blake, for all his joviality, was hiding something. The question was what, and whether it led to the ring's disappearance. Chapter 5. The Caterer's Ambition. The atmosphere in Hartley Hall's drawing room had grown taut, like a violin string stretched to its limit. The guests, their earlier gaiety now a distant memory, sat in hushed clusters, their eyes flickering toward the side parlor where Inspector Crane conducted his relentless inquiries. The theft of Mrs. Hartley's ruby ring had transformed the cocktail party into a theater of suspicion, each guest a potential player in a drama yet to be resolved. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her accustomed corner, her knitting needles clicking with serene precision, observed the shifting dynamics with a clarity that cut through the room's unease. Her spectacles glinted as she watched Mrs. Clara Weston, the caterer, rise at Inspector Crane's summons, her brisk stride betraying none of the nervousness Miss Marple had noted earlier. Mrs. Weston was a woman of formidable presence, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a starched cap, her black dress and apron crisp despite the evening's demands. Her catering business had become the pride of St. Mary Mead, its reputation built on her meticulous attention to detail and an ambition that burned brighter than the chandeliers above. Yet, as she crossed the room, Miss Marple caught the subtle twist of her apron between her fingers, a small, unconscious gesture that spoke of strain beneath her polished exterior. The ruby-colored bead Miss Marple had found in the kitchen, now nestled in her pocket, weighed heavily in her thoughts, a silent question mark beside Mrs. Weston's name. In the parlor, Inspector Crane's voice was calm but probing, its cadence carrying through the slightly ajar door to where Miss Marple sat, her knitting a perfect cover for her attentive ear. "Mrs. Weston," he began, "you stated you were in the kitchen overseeing your staff when the ring went missing. Can you confirm your movements between 8:30 and 9 o'clock?" Mrs. Weston's response was firm, her voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. "I was in the kitchen, Inspector, as I told you. We were preparing the second round of canapes, crab puffs, cucumber sandwiches, and those little salmon tarts Mrs. Hartley is so fond of. My staff can confirm I was there, directing every detail. A party like this doesn't run itself, you know." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but Miss Marple detected a defensive edge, as if she anticipated doubt. Crane's pencil scratched across his notebook. "And you didn't leave the kitchen at any point? Not even briefly?" There was a pause, brief but noticeable, and Miss Marple's needles slowed as she listened. "Well," Mrs. Weston said, her voice slightly less assured, "I did step into the hallway for a moment, just before 9. There was a delivery at the back door. Extra ice, you see, as we were running low. I went to check it was handled properly, but I was gone only a minute or two, no more." Her words were precise, but Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing, as if Mrs. Weston were measuring each syllable to avoid a misstep. "Did you pass the powder room on your way to or from the back door?" Crane asked, his tone neutral, but his eyes, Miss Marple imagined, fixed on her reaction. "No," Mrs. Weston replied quickly. "The back door is the other way, through the service corridor. I didn't go near the powder room." Her answer was firm, but Miss Marple's mind flickered to the layout of Hartley Hall. The service corridor did indeed lead to the back door, but a slight detour could take one past the powder room's entrance. A minute or two, she thought, was enough for a swift hand to slip inside, especially in the chaos of a bustling party. Crane made a note, his voice steady. "And your staff, they were with you the entire time?" "Most of them," Mrs. Weston said. "My head server, Molly, was arranging trays, and the others were plating desserts. They'll tell you I was there, keeping things in order." Her confidence returned, but Miss Marple wondered about that brief absence. A delivery of ice was plausible, yet it provided a convenient excuse for leaving the kitchen at the critical moment. As Crane continued his questions, Miss Marple rose quietly, her knitting tucked into her bag, and made her way toward the kitchen, her steps soft and purposeful. The kitchen was a hive of activity, with servers bustling about, their black uniforms with red piping a uniform blur. A tray of untouched canapes sat near the door, confirming Mrs. Weston's claim of a busy evening, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the floor, where she had found the ruby-colored bead earlier. She knelt, her eyes scanning for further clues, and spotted a faint scuff mark near the service door, a mark that could have been made by a hurried foot. It was not definitive, but it suggested movement, perhaps in haste. She approached Molly, the head server, a young woman with a harried expression and flour-dusted hands. "Molly, dear," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "It's been such a trying evening. Mrs. Weston must be grateful for your help. Was she in the kitchen all evening, keeping things running smoothly?" Molly nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Oh yes, Miss Marple. Mrs. Weston was everywhere, checking the trays, making sure the tarts were perfect. She's particular, you know. But she did pop out for a bit, said something about ice at the back door. Wasn't gone long, though." Her words corroborated Mrs. Weston's story, but Miss Marple noted the lack of precision in the timing. A bit could mean anything from a minute to 10, and in a theft, seconds mattered. Miss Marple thanked her and returned to the drawing room, her mind turning over the bead and the scuff mark. The bead matched the red piping on the servers' uniforms, but Mrs. Weston's apron had no such adornment. Could one of her staff have been involved, or had the bead come from Mrs. Weston herself, perhaps from a spare uniform? The caterer's ambition was no secret. Village gossip spoke of her plans to expand her business to London, a venture that required capital. A ruby ring, sold discreetly, could fund such dreams, and Mrs. Weston's brief absence from the kitchen placed her near the scene of the crime. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts also lingered on the other suspects. Mr. Lionel Blake's nervous demeanor and proximity to the hallway suggested opportunity, though his alibi held for now. Mr. Victor Duval, the jeweler, with his calm expertise and lingering glances at the ring, remained a figure of interest, particularly given the smudge of reddish powder on the vanity, possibly jeweler's rouge, a tool of his trade. And Mrs. Hartley herself, with her theatrical distress and questionable story about the ring's origin, could not be dismissed. Each had a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete. As Mrs. Weston emerged from the parlor, her face composed but her hands still twisting her apron, Miss Marple watched her return to the kitchen, issuing sharp orders to her staff. The caterer's efficiency was admirable, but Miss Marple knew that ambition could drive even the most disciplined to desperate acts. She thought of the powder room's loose window latch, the absence of footprints outside. An inside job seemed increasingly likely, and Mrs. Weston's brief absence, however justified, placed her squarely in the frame. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles a steady rhythm against the murmurs of the drawing room. The ruby ring was a catalyst, exposing the desires that simmered beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead's polite society. Mrs. Weston's ambition, like Mr. Blake's debts or Mr. Duval's expertise, was a thread in the tapestry of motive, and Miss Marple was determined to follow it. She glanced at the kitchen door where Mrs. Weston's silhouette was just visible and felt the weight of the bead in her pocket. It was a small clue, but in her experience, the smallest threads often led to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 6. The Jeweler's Expertise. The drawing room of Hartley Hall, though still bathed in the golden glow of its chandeliers, had taken on a strained hush, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation of the next revelation. The guests, their earlier elegance now tinged with suspicion, sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting toward the side parlor, where Inspector Crane continued his methodical questioning. The theft of Mrs. Hartley's ruby ring had cast a pall over the evening, transforming the convivial gathering into a chessboard where each move was scrutinized for hidden intent. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her corner with her knitting, observed the scene with her characteristic clarity, her needles clicking softly as her mind wove together the threads of motive and opportunity. Inspector Crane emerged from the parlor, his stern features softened by a flicker of fatigue, and summoned Mr. Victor Duval, the London jeweler. Mr. Duval rose with a grace that contrasted sharply with the nervous energy of the other guests. His lean frame, clad in an impeccably tailored suit, moved with a quiet confidence, and his dark eyes, sharp and assessing, betrayed no hint of unease. Yet Miss Marple, whose village wisdom had taught her to read the subtlest of cues, noted the way his hand brushed his waistcoat pocket, where the faint outline of a small tool, a jeweler's loop, perhaps, could be discerned. It was a gesture she had observed earlier, when his gaze had lingered on the ruby ring with an intensity that spoke of more than professional admiration. As Mr. Duval followed Crane into the parlor, Miss Marple adjusted her position slightly, her chair offering a clear line to the open door. Her knitting continued, a perfect mask for her attentive ear, as she listened to the inspector's measured voice. "Mr. Duval," Crane began, his pencil poised, "you were in the drawing room when Mrs. Hartley discovered the ring was missing. Can you confirm your whereabouts between 8:30 and 9 Otanju system? O'clock?" Mr. Duval's voice was smooth, almost languid, a stark contrast to the inspector's clipped tones. "I was by the window, admiring the gardens of Hartley Hall, a fine view, even in the dark. I did not leave the drawing room during that time." His words were precise, delivered with a calm that bordered on detachment. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly, her mind turning over his response. The window he referred to was at the far end of the drawing room, a good distance from the hallway to the powder room, but not so far as to make a quick exit impossible. His composure intrigued her. It was the sort of calm that could mask calculation, and his expertise as a jeweler made him a unique figure in this drama. She recalled the smudge of reddish powder on the powder room vanity, possibly jeweler's rouge, a substance used in his trade. The thought lingered, sharp and insistent. Crane pressed on. "You spoke with Mrs. Hartley about the ring earlier in the evening, I understand. You admired its craftsmanship?" "Indeed," Mr. Duval replied. "It is a remarkable piece, late Victorian, I'd wager, with a Burmese ruby of exceptional clarity. The setting is exquisite, though the prongs showed slight wear, which could affect its security." His tone was professional, but Miss Marple caught a faint note of pride, as if he relished displaying his knowledge. "And would such a ring be difficult to replicate?" Crane asked, his voice deceptively casual. Mr. Duval hesitated, a fraction of a second that Miss Marple's keen ear detected. "Difficult, but not impossible, for a skilled jeweler with the right materials. The ruby itself would be the challenge. Such stones are rare, but a convincing paste replica could be made, given time and expertise." His voice remained steady, but Miss Marple noted the way. His fingers brushed his pocket again, a gesture that seemed almost involuntary. Crane made a note, his expression unreadable. "And you saw nothing unusual near the hallway or powder room during that half hour?" "Nothing at all," Mr. Duval said, his smile faint but polite. "I was quite absorbed in the view and the conversation. A theft in such a setting is most unfortunate." His words were smooth, but Miss Marple sensed a guarded quality, as if he were choosing each one with care. As the interview concluded, Mr. Duval returned to the drawing room, his demeanor unruffled as he accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the way he stood apart, observing the room with a detached air. His calm was a stark contrast to Mr. Blake's nervous bluster and Mrs. Weston's brisk efficiency, and it set him apart as a man accustomed to control. Yet control, Miss Marple knew, could be a mask for cunning, and Mr. Duval's expertise gave him a particular advantage in this mystery. She rose quietly, her knitting tucked away, and approached the window where Mr. Duval had claimed to stand. The view was indeed fine, the gardens of Hartley Hall a shadowy expanse of manicured hedges and rose beds under the moonlight. But the window's position allowed a clear line of sight to the drawing-room's entrance, and a nimble man could easily slip toward the hallway unnoticed, especially in the party's bustle. Miss Marple's mind returned to the powder room, the loose latch, the smudge of powder, the absence of footprints outside. A jeweler, skilled in the art of gems, could orchestrate a theft with precision, perhaps even replacing the ring with a fake to delay discovery. She recalled a conversation at the village tea shop, where Mrs. Cleary had mentioned Mr. Duval's recent visit to the local inn, meeting a man with a shifty look and a case that might hold jewels. The detail, though gossipy, was intriguing. Could Mr. Duval have planned the theft in advance, perhaps with an accomplice? The idea of a fake ring lingered in her thoughts, for only a jeweler would have the skill to craft such a deception, and Mr. Duval's guarded demeanor suggested a mind capable of such a scheme. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her eyes on Mr. Duval as he engaged in polite conversation with a guest, his smile as polished as the gems he worked with. She thought of the other suspects, Mrs. Hartley's theatrical distress, Mr. Blake's shaky alibi, Mrs. Weston's ambitious absence. Each had their motives, but Mr. Duval's expertise set him apart, a man whose profession gave him both the means and the opportunity to steal a priceless jewel. The smudge of powder was a tantalizing clue, and Miss Marple resolved to examine the powder room again, if only to confirm her suspicions. As Inspector Crane called another guest, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles a steady rhythm against the murmur of the room. The ruby ring was a beacon, drawing out the hidden desires of those around it, and Mr. Duval's calm exterior only deepened her curiosity. She knew that truth, like a gem, required careful inspection to reveal its flaws, and Mr. Duval, with his jeweler's eye, was a puzzle she was determined to solve. Chapter 7. A Village Perspective. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. The village, with its quaint cottages and neatly trimmed hedges, stirred to life with the usual rhythm of daily chores, but the air carried a faint buzz of excitement, a ripple from the previous night's drama at Hartley Hall. The theft of Mrs. Hartley's ruby ring had set tongues wagging, and Miss Marple, sipping her morning tea by the window, knew that the village's gossip would be a rich vein to mine for clues. Her knitting lay beside her, a silent companion to her thoughts, which were already weaving through the events of the cocktail party, piecing together the fragments of human nature exposed by the missing jewel. She donned her sensible hat and coat, her appearance as unremarkable as ever, and set out for her daily walk, her destination the village post office. St. Mary Mead's post office was more than a place for stamps and parcels. It was the heart of the village's intelligence network, where Mrs. Cleary, the postmistress, presided with a keen ear and a ready tongue. Miss Marple knew that if any whispers about the suspects had surfaced, Mrs. Cleary would have heard them, and her knack for embellishment often hid kernels of truth that a discerning mind could sift out. The post office was a small, cluttered space, its counter piled with letters, and its walls adorned with notices about parish events. Mrs. Cleary, a stout woman with sharp eyes and a penchant for bright scarves, was sorting mail when Miss Marple entered, the bell above the door jingling softly. "Good morning, Jane," Mrs. Cleary said, her voice warm but tinged with eagerness. "What a to-do at Hartley Hall last night. A ruby ring stolen right under everyone's noses. Have you heard the latest?" Miss Marple smiled, settling onto a stool by the counter. "I was there, Mrs. Cleary, and it's a shocking business. I'm sure you've heard all sorts of tales already. Anything of interest?" Her tone was mild, but her eyes were alert, inviting the post-mistress to share. Mrs. Cleary leaned forward, her scarf slipping slightly. "Oh, indeed. They say Mrs. Hartley's beside herself. Poor thing, though some reckon she's playing it up a bit. But the real talk is about that jeweler, Mr. Duval. I saw him myself last week at the Rose and Crown. He was in the back room meeting a fellow with a shifty look. Carried a case, he did, like for jewels or such. Looked like they were up to no good, if you ask me." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of scandal. Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her mind seized on the detail. A case for jewels, and a secretive meeting at the inn. Could Mr. Duval have been planning the theft in advance, perhaps with an accomplice to fence the ring? "How curious," she said, her voice encouraging. "And this man, did you recognize him?" Mrs. Cleary shook her head. "Not a local, that's for sure. Thin, with a mustache, and a hat pulled low. Slipped out quick when he saw me looking. But Mr. Duval, he just smiled, cool as you please, and paid for his tea like nothing was amiss." She paused, sorting a letter. "Mind you, there's talk about the others too. Mrs. Weston, the caterer, she was at the bank last month, asking about a loan. Wants to open a shop in London, they say. Ambitious, that one, but I reckon she's stretched thin already." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the information. Mrs. Weston's ambition was well known, but a loan suggested financial pressure, a motive that could make a ruby ring an irresistible temptation. "And Mr. Blake?" she prompted, knowing Mrs. Cleary's gossip would extend to the landowner's troubles. "Oh, Lionel Blake!" Mrs. Cleary's eyes widened. "He was in much Benham last week, arguing with a man in a fancy suit, some creditor, folks say. Word is, he's in deep with those gambling types. Always at the races or the card tables, that one. A ring like that could clear his slate, couldn't it?" She leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Though I'd not put it past Mrs. Hartley herself to have hidden it. She's got a flair for the dramatic, and who's to say she didn't want the insurance money?" Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. Mrs. Cleary's speculations, though wild, echoed her own thoughts about Mrs. Hartley's theatrical distress. "You've a sharp eye, Mrs. Cleary," she said, rising. "It's a puzzle, to be sure, but villages like ours have a way of revealing their secrets." She thanked the postmistress and stepped out into the crisp morning, her mind turning over the new threads of information. The walk back to her cottage took her past the Rose and Crown, where she paused to glance at the inn's weathered facade. Mr. Duval's meeting with a stranger suggested premeditation, and the case for jewels hinted at a plan to dispose of the ring, or perhaps to craft a replica. She thought of the smudge of reddish powder in the powder room, possibly jeweler's rouge, and Mr. Duval's guarded demeanor. His expertise made him a prime candidate for a sophisticated theft, but the absence of footprints outside the powder room window pointed to an inside job, and his calm presence by the drawing room window placed him far from the scene. Mrs. Weston's lone inquiry, meanwhile, added weight to her motive. A woman driven by ambition might see a priceless jewel as a shortcut to her dreams, and her brief absence from the kitchen provided opportunity, however slim. The ruby-colored bead from the kitchen, matching her staff's uniforms, remained a nagging clue, though it could belong to a server rather than Mrs. Weston herself. And Mr. Blake's argument with a creditor confirmed his financial straits, making his nervous fidgeting and shaky alibi all the more suspicious. Yet Mrs. Hartley's possible insurance scheme could not be dismissed, her story about the ring's sentimental value undermined by village talk of its recent purchase. Miss Marple reached her cottage, settling into her armchair with a fresh cup of tea. She opened her knitting bag, but her hands remained still, her thoughts consumed by the puzzle. The ruby ring was a catalyst, exposing the cracks in the suspects' facades, and the village's gossip had added depth to her suspicions. Each suspect had a motive: greed, ambition, desperation, but the means and opportunity remained elusive. The powder room, with its loose latch and smudged vanity, held the key, and Miss Marple resolved to revisit it, certain that its secrets would illuminate the path to the truth. As she sipped her tea, she thought of Saint Mary Mead's quiet wisdom, its ability to reveal what pride and cunning sought to hide. The ruby ring was more than a jewel. It was a mirror reflecting the desires of those who coveted it, and Miss Marple, with her unerring eye for human nature, was determined to see through its glare. Chapter 8. The Window Clue. The late morning light streamed through the tall windows of Hartley Hall, casting long shadows across the polished floors as Miss Jane Marple arrived, her sensible shoes tapping softly on the parquet. The grandeur of the manor seemed subdued in the aftermath of the previous night's theft, its elegance tinged with the lingering unease of suspicion. Inspector Crane had permitted Miss Marple to revisit the scene, his grudging acquiescence a testament to her reputation in St. Mary Mead for unraveling mysteries that baffled more official minds. She carried her knitting bag, a prop as familiar as her shrewd gaze, but her purpose was singular: to examine the powder room where Mrs. Hartley's ruby ring had vanished. The hallway leading to the powder room was quiet, the bustle of the cocktail party replaced by an eerie stillness. Miss Marple paused at the door, her eyes tracing the frame, noting its silent hinges and sturdy lock. The powder room itself was, as she remembered, a small, elegant space with pale green silk wallpaper, a gilt-framed mirror, and a marble vanity that gleamed under the soft light of a single sconce. The porcelain basin stood pristine, but it was the faint smudge of reddish powder near its edge, still undisturbed, that drew her attention. She bent closer, her spectacles catching the light, and confirmed her suspicion. The powder resembled jeweler's rouge, a substance used to polish gems, its presence a silent accusation in the otherwise immaculate room. Her gaze shifted to the window, high and narrow, its latch slightly askew as she had noted the previous evening. She approached it, her movements deliberate, and tested the latch with a gentle push. It gave way easily, the window swinging outward with a faint creak. The opening was small, barely wide enough for a person to slip through, but Miss Marple's mind was already calculating possibilities. A nimble thief, perhaps a servant or someone familiar with the house, could manage it, though the absence of footprints in the flower bed outside suggested otherwise. She leaned out, her eyes scanning the garden below. The rose bushes were undisturbed, their petals intact, but a single ruby-colored thread, caught on a thorn, fluttered in the breeze. Miss Marple carefully plucked the thread, holding it to the light. It matched the ruby-colored bead she had found in the kitchen, a detail that pointed to someone in a server's uniform, Mrs. Weston's staff, or perhaps the caterer herself. She tucked the thread into her pocket alongside the bead, her thoughts turning to the timeline of the theft. Mrs. Hartley had left the ring on the vanity at 8:30, and her scream had pierced the air at 9. 30 minutes was a narrow window, but in the chaos of a party, with guests and servants moving freely, it was enough for a calculated act. She returned to the vanity, her fingers brushing the marble where the smudge lay. The jeweler's rouge suggested Mr. Duval's involvement, his expertise making him a prime candidate for a theft that required precision. Yet the window's loose latch hinted at an outside accomplice, a possibility that conflicted with the lack of external evidence. Miss Marple's mind flickered to Mrs. Weston's brief absence from the kitchen, her claim of checking a delivery of ice. The service corridor led past the powder room, and a quick detour could have placed her there. Mr. Blake, too, had been seen near the hallway, his nervous demeanor and gambling debts marking him as a suspect. And Mrs. Hartley's theatrical distress, coupled with her questionable story about the ring's origin, kept her in the frame, perhaps as a conspirator in her own loss. Miss Marple stepped back, her eyes sweeping the room one last time. The powder room was a stage, its clues carefully arranged or carelessly overlooked by the thief. The rouge, the thread, the latch, each was a piece of a puzzle that refused to resolve. She thought of the village gossip from Mrs. Cleary, the mention of Mr. Duval's meeting with a shifty stranger at the Rose and Crown. A jeweler planning a theft might need an accomplice to dispose of the ring, but the window's role suggested a more complex scheme, one that might involve misdirection. She left the powder room and returned to the drawing room, where a few lingering guests awaited further instructions from Inspector Crane. Mrs. Hartley sat by the fireplace, her sapphire gown exchanged for a somber gray dress, her face pale but composed. Mr. Blake was at the sideboard, pouring a brandy with hands that trembled slightly, while Mrs. Weston directed her staff with crisp efficiency, her apron pristine. Mr. Duval stood by the window, his posture as calm as ever, though Miss Marple noted a brief glance toward the hallway, as if he sensed her scrutiny. She approached Inspector Crane, who was reviewing his notes near the parlor door. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but firm, "might I suggest a closer look at the window in the powder room? The latch is loose, and there's a thread caught outside that may be of interest." She offered the ruby-colored thread, her expression one of polite concern. Crane's eyes narrowed, but he took the thread, examining it closely. "A server's uniform, perhaps," he muttered, his tone grudgingly appreciative. "We'll have it checked. Anything else, Miss Marple?" "Only a thought," she said, her smile faint. "The powder room is small, but its clues are telling. The smudge on the vanity. Have you considered it might be jeweler's rouge?" She left the question hanging, her eyes meeting his briefly before she returned to her seat. Crane made a note, his skepticism tempered by her reputation. "We'll look into it," he said, and turned to summon a constable to inspect the window further. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles a steady rhythm, as her mind sifted through the clues. The thread linked to Mrs. Weston's staff, but the rouge pointed to Mr. Duval, and the loose latch suggested a plan that might involve both. Mr. Blake's proximity to the hallway and Mrs. Hartley's possible insurance motive added layers to the mystery, each suspect a thread in a tapestry of deceit. As she knitted, Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead's quiet wisdom, its ability to reveal what pride and cunning sought to conceal. The ruby ring was a spark that had ignited hidden desires, and the powder room, with its silent clues, was the key to unlocking them. She glanced at the suspects, their faces a study in guarded composure, and knew that the truth was close, waiting for her to tug the right thread. Chapter 9. A Hidden Motive. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting a delicate web of shadows across her sitting room. The village of St. Mary Mead hummed with its usual quiet rhythm, but the air carried a faint undercurrent of excitement. The theft of Mrs. Hartley's ruby ring, still the talk of every tea shop and garden gate. Miss Marple, seated in her favorite armchair with a cup of Earl Grey, had spent the morning reflecting on the clues gathered thus far. The smudge of jeweler's rouge on the powder room vanity, the ruby-colored bead from the kitchen, the thread caught on the rosebush, and the loose window latch. Each was a fragment of a larger truth, and she knew that the key to unraveling the mystery lay not only in the physical evidence, but in the desires that drove the suspects to act. To probe deeper, Miss Marple had devised a plan as subtle as it was effective, a small tea gathering at her cottage, to which she invited Mrs. Hartley, Mr. Blake, Mrs. Weston, and Mr. Duval. Such gatherings were common in St. Mary Mead, their informality a perfect stage for observing unguarded moments. Her invitation, couched in terms of offering solace after the dreadful business at Hartley Hall, had been accepted with varying degrees of enthusiasm. And now, as the clock struck 3, her guests began to arrive. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley was the first, sweeping into the cottage in a tailored coat of dove gray, her face a study in controlled distress. She settled onto the chintz sofa, her hands fluttering briefly before clasping a lace handkerchief. "Oh, Miss Marple," she sighed, "you're so kind to have us here. I'm still quite shaken, you know. That ring, it meant so much to me." Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted around the room, as if seeking an audience for her grief. Mr. Lionel Blake arrived next, his robust frame filling the doorway. His usual joviality was tempered, though he managed a hearty smile as he accepted a cup of tea. "A fine spread, Miss Marple," he said, eyeing the scones and cucumber sandwiches. "Takes the edge off a rotten evening, eh?" Yet his fingers fidgeted with his watch chain, a nervous habit that Miss Marple had come to associate with his unease. Mrs. Clara Weston followed, her brisk efficiency softened by the occasion. She offered to help with the tea, her hands smoothing her apron as she arranged cups with practiced precision. "It's good to be out of the kitchen for a bit," she said, her smile tight. "Last night was a trial for us all." Miss Marple noted the faint strain in her voice, a reminder of her ambition and the ruby-colored bead that linked her to the crime scene. Mr. Victor Duval was the last to arrive, his lean figure immaculate in a charcoal suit. He took a seat by the window, his dark eyes scanning the room with a detached air. "A charming invitation, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Your cottage is a haven from the village's clamor." His calm was unshaken, but Miss Marple caught the brief brush of his hand against his waistcoat pocket, where the outline of a jeweler's loop remained. As the tea was poured and pleasantries exchanged, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward the ring, her tone one of innocent curiosity. "Such a dreadful loss, Mrs. Hartley," she said, passing a plate of scones. "A ring like that must have been terribly valuable. Was it insured for a great sum?" Mrs. Hartley's eyes widened, her handkerchief pressed to her lips. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple. Fully insured, thank heavens. But it's not the money, it's the sentiment. My late husband, you know, chose it for me." Her voice quavered, but Miss Marple recalled the village gossip that the ring was a recent auction purchase, not a cherished heirloom. The discrepancy suggested a motive, perhaps an insurance claim to bolster strained finances, but Mrs. Hartley's distress seemed genuine, if a touch theatrical. Mr. Blake, sipping his tea, shifted uncomfortably. "Nasty business theft," he said, his voice a shade too loud. "Never thought I'd see such a thing in St. Mary Mead. Makes you wonder who you can trust." His eyes darted to Mrs. Weston, then away, and Miss Marple noted the tension in his jaw. She recalled Mrs. Cleary's tale of his argument with a creditor, a hint of financial desperation that made the ring a tempting prize. To test him, Miss Marple turned the conversation to value. "Mr. Blake, you've traveled widely. Monte Carlo, I believe. You must have seen many fine jewels. Would a ring like Mrs. Hartley's fetch a high price?" Her question was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. Blake coughed, nearly spilling his tea. "Well, I suppose so. Never been one for jewels myself, but a ruby like that could clear a man's troubles, I'd wager." He laughed, a forced sound, and quickly added, "Not that I'd know, mind you. I once pawned a family watch, silver, nothing grand, but that's the extent of it." His admission, though casual, was a slip, and Miss Marple filed it away, noting his discomfort at the mention of pawning. Mrs. Weston, arranging a tray of sandwiches, spoke up, her voice brisk. "It's a shame, really. A ring like that deserves better than to be snatched. I've worked too hard, building my business to see such things happen under my nose." Her words were pointed, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of ambition in her eyes, a reminder of her lone inquiry and the bead that linked her to the kitchen. Miss Marple turned to Mr. Duval, her tone disarming. "And you, Mr. Duval, with your expertise, such a ring must be a marvel to a jeweler. Could it be replicated, do you think?" She leaned forward, her smile one of innocent curiosity. Mr. Duval's eyes narrowed briefly before he smiled, his fingers brushing his pocket. "A skilled jeweler could craft a replica, certainly, though the ruby's quality would be hard to match. Paste can fool the untrained eye, but it's a costly endeavor." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the way his gaze lingered on her, as if assessing her intent. The mention of a replica, coupled with the smudge of jeweler's rouge, strengthened her suspicion of his involvement. As the tea progressed, Miss Marple observed the interplay of her guests. Mrs. Hartley's theatricality was undimmed, her sighs drawing sympathetic glances from Mr. Blake, who seemed eager to please. Mrs. Weston's efficiency masked a nervous energy, her hands rarely still. Mr. Duval, however, remained an enigma, his calm a shield that invited scrutiny. When he excused himself briefly to admire a vase on the mantel, Miss Marple noticed a small magnifying glass slip from his pocket, quickly retrieved. It was a jeweler's tool, and its presence confirmed her suspicions about his trade and his potential role in the theft. The gathering drew to a close, the guests departing with polite thanks, but Miss Marple's mind was alight with new insights. Mrs. Hartley's insurance motive, Mr. Blake's financial slip, Mrs. Weston's ambition, and Mr. Duval's guarded expertise each added depth to the mystery. The ruby ring was a catalyst, exposing hidden desires, and Miss Marple knew that the truth lay in the interplay of these motives. As she cleared the tea tray, her thoughts returned to the powder room, the rouge, the thread, the latch, and the possibility that the thief had left more than physical clues. The tea had been a mirror, reflecting the suspects' true selves, and Miss Marple was closer than ever to seeing the whole picture. Chapter 10. The Trap is Set. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over Hartley Hall, its rays softening the manor's austere elegance as Miss Jane Marple arrived, her knitting bag slung over her arm like a shield of domesticity. The hall, still reeling from the theft of Mrs. Hartley's ruby ring, buzzed with a subdued energy, the servants moving quietly, and the remaining guests gathered in the drawing room, their faces etched with a mix of curiosity and unease. Miss Marple, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, had spent the day refining her theory. The clues, jeweler's rouge, a ruby-colored bead, a thread on a rose bush, and a loose window latch, pointing to a calculated act of deception. Now she proposed a plan to Inspector Crane, one designed to flush out the thief by exploiting their own cunning. In the quiet of the side parlor, Miss Marple sat opposite Crane, her voice soft but resolute. "Inspector, I believe the thief is still among us, watching and waiting. If we were to announce that a duplicate ring has been found, hidden in the powder room, it might provoke a reaction. A guilty party may reveal themselves, either by panic or an attempt to retrieve the real ring." Her suggestion was delivered with the gentle insistence of a village spinster, but her gaze was unwavering, her logic honed by years of unraveling St. Mary Mead's secrets. Crane's brow furrowed, his skepticism tempered by her reputation. "A bold move, Miss Marple. Risky, too, but if you're right, it could shake things loose. What's your plan for the announcement?" "Mrs. Hartley must make it," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking softly in her lap. "She's the center of this drama, and her word will carry weight. I've a paste ring from my own collection, nothing grand, but convincing enough in dim light. Let her display it at a gathering tonight, claiming it was found in a crevice by the vanity. We'll watch the suspects closely." Crane nodded, his pencil tapping his notebook. "Very well. I'll arrange for the guests to return this evening, but we'll need men stationed discreetly, hallway, garden, everywhere. If the thief moves, we'll catch them." His tone was grudgingly admiring, and Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile, knowing her plan hinged on human nature's predictability. By evening, Hartley Hall was once again alight, though the mood was far from festive. The drawing room, its chandeliers dimmed to a soft glow, hosted a smaller gathering. Mrs. Hartley, Mr. Blake, Mrs. Weston, Mr. Duval, and a few other guests to maintain the pretense of a social call. Miss Marple took her usual corner, her knitting a steady rhythm, her eyes scanning the room. Mrs. Hartley, dressed in a subdued emerald gown, stood by the fireplace, her face pale but composed. In her hand, she held the paste ring Miss Marple had provided, a clever imitation with a crimson glass stone that caught the light convincingly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Hartley began, her voice carrying a practiced tremor. "I have astonishing news. This afternoon, while cleaning, a maid found this in the powder room, tucked in a crevice by the vanity." She held up the paste ring, its false ruby glinting. "It seems my ring wasn't stolen after all, just misplaced." Her smile was radiant, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease in her eyes, as if she feared the deception might unravel. The room erupted in murmurs, a mix of relief and surprise. Mr. Blake, standing by the sideboard, let out a hearty laugh, though his eyes darted to the ring with a hungry intensity. "Well, that's a stroke of luck, Eleanor. Saved you a pretty penny, eh?" His voice was jovial, but Miss Marple caught the tension in his shoulders, as if he were bracing for something. Mrs. Weston, arranging a tray of tea, paused, her hands stilling on a teapot. "How extraordinary," she said, her tone clipped. "To think it was there all along." Her eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, and Miss Marple noted a flash of confusion, perhaps suspicion, before she resumed her task with brisk efficiency. Mr. Duval, by the window, showed no reaction at first, his face a mask of calm. But as Mrs. Hartley passed the ring to Mrs. Pumphrey for inspection, his gaze followed it, his fingers brushing his waistcoat pocket. "A fortunate find," he said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. Miss Marple's heart quickened. His composure was too perfect, a shield for something deeper. Inspector Crane, stationed near the door, watched the scene with a hawk's focus, his constables discreetly positioned in the hallway and garden. Miss Marple, her knitting needles a steady rhythm, observed the suspects' reactions, each a clue to their guilt or innocence. The paste ring was a spark, designed to ignite a response, and she sensed the thief was close to betraying themselves. As the evening progressed, the guests mingled, their conversation stilted but polite. Miss Marple, moving quietly among them, engaged Mr. Blake in small talk. "Such a relief for Mrs. Hartley," she said, her tone innocent. "A ring like that could tempt anyone, I suppose, especially someone in need." Her words were gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching for a reaction. Blake's smile faltered, his hand tightening on his glass. "Temptation's a devil, Miss Marple, but I'm no thief. Been near ruin before, mind you, but I keep my hands clean." His laugh was forced, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow, a sign of nerves that matched his gambling debts. She moved to Mrs. Weston, offering a compliment on the tea. "You've managed marvelously under such strain," she said. "It must be hard, with your ambitions for London, to have this shadow over the evening." Mrs. Weston's smile was tight, her fingers twisting her apron. "I manage, Miss Marple. A theft's bad for business, but I've nothing to hide." Yet her eyes flicked to the paste ring, and Miss Marple sensed a flicker of doubt, perhaps fear. Mr. Duval, however, proved the most elusive. When Miss Marple approached, he was examining a porcelain figurine, his demeanor unruffled. "A clever ruse, this found ring," he said, his voice low, as if speaking only to her. "You're a sharp one, Miss Marple." His smile was faint, but his eyes held a challenge, and Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. He knew the ring was false. His expertise would see through the paste, but his calm suggested confidence, perhaps arrogance. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple noticed Mr. Duval excuse himself, citing a headache, and slipped toward the study. She signaled Crane with a subtle nod, then followed discreetly, her steps silent on the carpet. Through the study's half-open door, she saw Duval approach a bookcase, his fingers deftly retrieving a small package from behind a volume of Dickens. Her heart quickened. The trap had worked. Crane, alerted by her signal, entered the study with a constable, catching Duval as he opened the package. Inside was the real ruby ring, its crimson glow unmistakable. "Mr. Duval," Crane said, his voice hard. "Care to explain?" Duval's composure cracked, his shoulders sagging. "I meant to return it," he said, his voice low. "A moment of weakness, Inspector." But Miss Marple knew better. His plan had been to replace the ring with a fake, a scheme only a jeweler could execute. The room fell silent as Crane led Duval away. The paste ring still in Mrs. Hartley's hand, its purpose served. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her eyes on the retreating figure of the thief. The trap had sprung, and the truth, like a gem, had been revealed by the simplest of ploys. Chapter 11. The Jeweler's Confession. The drawing room of Hartley Hall, though still grand in its chandelier-lit splendor, held a charged silence as Inspector Crane led Mr. Victor Duval back from the study, the ruby ring gleaming in the small package clutched in his hand. The guests, their faces a mixture of shock and curiosity, parted to let the inspector pass, their whispers hushed as if the very walls might overhear. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, still holding the paste ring Miss Jane Marple had provided, stood frozen by the fireplace, her emerald gown catching the light as her eyes widened in disbelief. Mr. Lionel Blake, gripping his brandy glass, stared open-mouthed, while Mrs. Clara Weston, her apron twisted in her hands, watched with a mixture of relief and wariness. Miss Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity. Her needles paused as she awaited the denouement of her carefully laid trap. Inspector Crane, his stern features set in a mask of authority, addressed the room. "Mr. Duval has something to say," he announced, his voice cutting through the tension. He held up the package, the ruby ring's crimson glow visible through its wrapping. "This was found in his possession, hidden in the study. I think we'd all like to hear his explanation." Mr. Duval, his lean frame no longer exuding the calm confidence of earlier, stood with a slight stoop, his dark eyes flickering over the assembled guests. His hand, which had so often brushed the jeweler's loop in his waistcoat pocket, now hung limply at his side. For a moment he seemed poised to deny everything, but under the weight of Crane's gaze and Miss Marple's quiet scrutiny, his resolve crumbled. "Very well," he said, his voice low but clear, carrying a trace of resignation. "I took the ring. It was a moment of folly, a temptation I couldn't resist." He paused, his eyes darting to Mrs. Hartley, who gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "But I swear, I intended to return it, eventually." Crane's eyes narrowed. "Return it? After hiding it in a bookcase? You'll need to do better than that, Mr. Duval. Start from the beginning." Duval drew a deep breath, his composure fraying at the edges. "It began at the start of the evening," he said. "Mrs. Hartley was showing off the ring, and I could see its value at once, a Burmese ruby, flawless, set in Victorian gold. As a jeweler, I knew its worth, and I saw an opportunity. I'd been approached by a dealer in London, a man who deals in rare gems, no questions asked. He'd pay handsomely for such a piece, and I've had debts of my own, debts that have weighed heavily." His voice faltered, and Miss Marple noted the absence of his earlier polish, replaced by a raw honesty that confirmed her suspicions. "I planned it carefully," Duval continued, his gaze fixed on the floor. I'd crafted a paste replica weeks ago, after hearing Mrs. Hartley was to display the ring. I brought it with me, intending to make the switch during the party. When Mrs. Hartley mentioned she was going to the powder room, I saw my chance. The drawing room was crowded, the guests distracted. I slipped into the hallway, claiming I needed air, and entered the powder room moments after she left. The ring was there, on the vanity, just as she'd said. Miss Marple's mind flashed to the smudge of jeweler's rouge she had found on the vanity, a detail that had pointed to Duval's trade. His confession aligned with her theory, but she listened closely, alert for any discrepancies. "I took the ring," Duval said, "and replaced it with the paste, but I didn't have time to leave it on the vanity. Mrs. Hartley returned too quickly. I pocketed both rings and loosened the window latch to suggest an outside thief. Then I slipped back to the drawing room, standing by the window as if nothing had happened. I hid the real ring in the study later, intending to retrieve it after the fuss died down and sell it to my contact." Crane's pencil scratched furiously, his voice sharp. "And the paste ring? Where is it now?" Duval's lips tightened. "I dropped it in my haste, somewhere in the powder room. I couldn't risk going back to look. When Mrs. Hartley screamed, I knew the plan had gone awry, but I thought I could still escape notice." He glanced at Miss Marple, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. I didn't count on her sharpness. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, her knitting untouched, but her mind was alive with confirmation. The jeweler's rouge, the loose latch, Duval's guarded demeanor, all fit his confession. Yet she noted his mention of debts, a detail not previously surfaced in village gossip. It added depth to his motive, aligning with Mrs. Cleary's tale of his meeting with a shifty stranger at the Rose and Crown, likely the dealer he spoke of. Crane turned to Mrs. Hartley. "Can you confirm the ring's authenticity?" He handed her the package and she unwrapped it, her hands trembling. The ruby ring gleamed, its fire unmistakable, even in the dim light. She nodded, tears welling. "It's mine," she whispered. "Oh, thank heaven." Miss Marple, however, was not entirely satisfied. She rose, her voice gentle but probing. "Mr. Duval, the paste ring you mentioned, did it require jeweler's rouge to craft? I noticed a smudge on the vanity, you see." Her question was innocent, but her eyes were sharp, watching for his reaction. Duval's face paled slightly, but he nodded. "Yes, I used rouge to polish the setting. I must have left a trace in my hurry." His admission sealed the connection, and Miss Marple's suspicions about the smudge were confirmed. Crane signaled to a constable, who stepped forward to escort Duval. "You'll come with us, Mr. Duval. There's a cell waiting in Much Benham while we verify your story." As Duval was led away, the room erupted in murmurs, the guests' relief tinged with shock. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. The ruby-colored bead and thread, she realized, were red herrings, likely from a server's uniform, dropped during the chaos of the party. Mr. Blake's debts and Mrs. Weston's ambition, though compelling, had been distractions, their nervous behaviors a reflection of personal troubles rather than guilt. Mrs. Hartley's theatricality, too, was merely her nature, her insurance motive, a possibility that faded in the face of Duval's confession. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple reflected on the simplicity of the trap. The paste ring had provoked Duval's panic, leading him to check his hiding place, and her village wisdom had done the rest. The ruby ring was a spark that had illuminated human greed, and Mr. Duval, with his jeweler's precision, had been its thief. Chapter 12. The Ring Restored. The drawing room of Hartley Hall, though still resplendent with its chandeliers and polished mahogany, seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief as the truth about the ruby ring's theft was laid bare. The guests, their faces a mixture of astonishment and vindication, lingered in small clusters, their whispers weaving a tapestry of gossip that would soon spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley stood by the fireplace, the real ruby ring now gleaming on her finger, its crimson fire restored to its rightful place. Her emerald gown caught the light, but her expression held a trace of chagrin, as if the resolution of the mystery had robbed her of the spotlight she so cherished. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner, resumed her knitting with a serene rhythm, her spectacles glinting as she observed the final act of the drama she had orchestrated. Inspector Crane, his stern demeanor softened by the satisfaction of a case closed, addressed the room with a brisk authority. "Thanks to Miss Marple's insight, we've recovered Mrs. Hartley's ring and apprehended the culprit, Mr. Victor Duval. He's on his way to Much Benham for further questioning, and I expect a full accounting of his actions will follow." His eyes flicked to Miss Marple, a grudging nod acknowledging her pivotal role. "The matter is resolved, and you're all free to go." Mrs. Hartley, clutching the ring as if it might vanish again, stepped forward, her voice tremulous but warm. "Oh, Miss Marple, how can I ever thank you? To think it was here all along, hidden in that dreadful man's package. I was beside myself, truly." She pressed a hand to her heart, her eyes brimming with tears that Miss Marple suspected were as much for effect as for emotion. "You've saved me from such distress." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her needles clicking softly. "Not at all, Mrs. Hartley. It was merely a matter of observing what was there. People, you know, are rarely as clever as they think." Her words were kind, but her gaze was sharp, noting the hostess's flair for drama, a trait that had clouded the case with unnecessary suspicion. Mr. Lionel Blake, his robust frame now relaxed, raised his brandy glass in a toast. "To Miss Marple, the sharpest eye in St. Mary Mead, saved us all from a right mess she has." His joviality was back, though Miss Marple caught a flicker of relief in his eyes, as if he knew how close his own debts had placed him under scrutiny. She recalled his nervous fidgeting, his slip about pawning a family heirloom, and knew his troubles were real, if unrelated to the theft. Mrs. Clara Weston, her apron discarded for the evening, approached with a tray of tea, her efficiency undimmed. "A dreadful business, Miss Marple, but you've said it right. I'm grateful it didn't taint my business. Catering's hard enough without a scandal." Her smile was tight, and Miss Marple noted the absence of her earlier strain, the ruby-colored bead and thread now dismissed as mere coincidences from her staff's busy movements. Mrs. Weston's ambition, though a potent motive, had been a distraction, her brief absence from the kitchen innocent after all. The guests began to depart, their murmurs of gratitude mingling with the clink of glasses and the rustle of coats. Inspector Crane lingered, his notebook tucked away, and approached Miss Marple. "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of admiration and exasperation. "That trick with the paste ring, I'd not have thought of it. How did you know it was Duval?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes meeting his with a quiet certainty. "It was the rouge, Inspector, jeweler's rouge on the vanity, left by someone who knew gems. Mr. Duval's expertise, his calm, his meeting with that stranger at the inn. It all pointed to a plan to steal and replace the ring with a fake. People, you see, betray themselves in the smallest ways. She resumed her knitting, her voice soft. And Saint Mary Mead has taught me to notice those ways. Crane nodded, a rare smile breaking through. Well, you've my thanks. We'll search for that paste ring he mentioned, likely still in the powder room, if he dropped it as he said. He tipped his hat and left, his constables trailing behind, leaving Hartley Hall to settle into its usual quiet. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose, accepting Mrs. Hartley's effusive thanks with a modest nod. As she stepped into the cool evening air, the village spread before her, its cottages aglow with lamplight. She walked home slowly, her thoughts drifting to the ruby ring and the desires it had ignited, greed in Duval, desperation in Blake, ambition in Weston, and vanity in Hartley. Each had been a suspect, their flaws illuminated by the jewel's allure, but only Duval's cunning had crossed into crime. At her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the window, her cat Pearl curling at her feet. She opened her knitting bag, her fingers brushing the ruby-colored bead and thread, now relics of a solved mystery. People are much the same everywhere, she murmured to Pearl, her voice soft as the night. And a ruby ring is just the thing to bring it all to light. The village slept, its secrets safe for now. But Miss Marple's eyes, ever watchful, knew that another puzzle would soon emerge, waiting for her to unravel its threads.